sharing your screen. And
Okay. There we go. And we'll put it in presentation. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name's Jim Urban, and I'm a landscape architect. I'm also a tree fund trustee and members of the communication and research committees for the tree fund. So it's been a real pleasure and privilege for me to be involved with the tree fund. I rode the Tour de Trees once and have been busy raising money ever since. So let's see, to go forward, I think I do that. So what is the tree fund? We support scientific discovery and the dissemination of knowledge in urban forestry and arboriculture. And I've been trying to make sure that the tree fund also includes landscape architects and the profession of landscape architecture. We award these grants and primarily for applied research on propagation, planting, and care for urban trees that we're all involved with. We also provide scholarships for students in arboriculture and urban forestry and related fields. And we provide education for kids in K through 12, which is, I think, one of the more fun parts of what we do. And we've, since 2002 in our founding, we've awarded over $4 million in research and education grants. If you want to see the kind of research that we're doing, or you have a particular question that you want to answer, you can go on to the treefund.org website to the research archive site, and you can search using the standard search spyglass, or you can just start scrolling through the tree fund research projects, which are organized by topic area. One of the things that we've been doing is that each of the ISA national conferences, we've been putting up this, what areas are you interested in? And typically year on year, root and soil management is the top vote getter of people who vote by putting little green dots up on the areas that they like. And when we're making grant decisions, we use this information to try to support things that are current questions in the field. As a result of these, we've started this new fund called the Tree and Soil Research Fund, which is going to look at questions specific to that particular area, with an emphasis on answering questions that are pertinent to landscape architecture and that profession. So today we're pleased to have Kathleen Wolf from the University of Washington in Seattle, who's going to be talking about the health benefits of city trees and research evidence and economic values. Her work has been really critical to building the case for funding more trees and planting better planting practices. Everything that we're interested in takes money, and Kathleen's work is showing us that it is directly related to human health. And as she's gone through the process over the years, the research that she's either done or gathered has been pretty amazing. You can see her work on her research website called naturewithin.info. And there's another site called Green Cities Good Health Project, which is greenhealth.washington.edu. But the way I get there is I simply type in Kathleen Wolf and trees, and I typically get right to where I want to go. So Kathleen, I'm going to turn it over to you And I'm going to stop sharing, and so then you will pick it up. Kathleen, you appear to be muted. There you go.
Yes, I'm on the way here. And we'll try that. And there we are. Is that working, everyone? All right. Such a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you a lot of fresh material. A lot of what I'm sharing through these slides today is the first run through, so it might be a little bumpy in some places as I work through the verbal expression of this. I've been doing a lot of writing of late, and so now I have an opportunity to share with you. I'm coming to you from Cleveland, and so the warm-up music here, it was great because, as many of you know, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum is here in Cleveland. Such a treasure and a wonderful place to visit. But I'm also here for the Partners in Community Forestry Conference, and perhaps I'll see some of you in the next couple of days. Some of the basics here. We not only within natural resources and urban forestry, but the public health community is really moving to better understanding of what are known as the social determinants of health. And this figure on the right, the social determinants are all of the circumstances of life, the conditions of our both built and social environments that influence our health. And it really speaks to a definition of health that was forwarded by the World Health Organization long ago. And that is that health is not only access to care facilities, doctors, hospitals, and so on, but it's much more. It's the physical, mental, and social well-being of people. And with regard to nature and health, broadly speaking, gardens, parks, tree cover, and so on. This is an article that was provided a summary by way of review of really what is the sort of strength of evidence at this point in time. And while this was a few years ago, I think it still holds. By the way, not only will this session be recorded, but at the end, I'll provide a link if you would like to come back and look at these slides and perhaps pick up some of the article references that I've included. But those four boxes in the center, we now have a fairly good understanding. It's fairly compelling that nature in the city improves air quality, and there's many associated diseases or illnesses associated with poor air quality. Physical activity is a mediator, or it influences physical, a variety of physical diseases and circumstances, chronic diseases. Social contacts are so important, not as well understood or recognized perhaps by the broader public, but enabling people to be together, informal connections, social contacts, very, very important to nurture and support good health. And finally, stress reduction. Our lives are now so full of low-level stressors, commuting, intense scheduling, work demands, school demands. All of this starts to build up, and our endocrine systems then respond, which can compromise our immune function, bring on diseases, and so on. And I know that a number of you have had the opportunity and the pleasure to present at various events. Just a quick reminder here, Green Cities Good Health, this research literature about nature and health is, it's found in many different disciplines, many different journals, and not always easy to access. So at the University of Washington, some graduate students and myself, with support from the Forest Service, have compiled this research into a website called Green Cities Good Health. And it's a portal, it's a beginning. It's an effort to share this information in a way that can be very used practically, newsletters, grant applications, and so on. Each of the topics on the left, there's a single page. It has a brief introduction at the top, some fast facts, some of the statistical highlights, and then the summary continues as an essay, all of it fully cited. If again, you want to go to those original references for any purpose. And here's the background of Green Cities Good Health. Lift the hood, and these are the publications, a representation of the publications. And we're now up to about 4,500 publications. Some of the essays need some updating, though they still represent some really important and sort of fundamental findings. But we continue to collect articles in the hopes of at one time getting some resources to do updates. But all that said, what this figure represents is the degree or level of research about nature broadly and health, with, say, active living, the bottom line, representing about 14% of the article collection. Safe streets up there at the top, not nearly as much research support, less than, well, approximately 1% of the collection. So here you see the range of different topics. Again, social determinants, not only literally disease and illness, but those factors in our communities, our households, across our cities that have an influence on human health. And you can see the level of publication has really taken off, particularly in this last decade. If I were to add the articles that have been published since 2015, that gray bar would be far extended. So this is something that is gaining research attention, but also because of the research, public policy attention. So I think those of us working in green industries, in research in nature and health, we're on the edge of, I think, some serious uptake in terms of what this means for city design, planning, and management. So let me now move to the topic of the webinar, which is a focus on city trees, the interest of many of you here on the webinar. So how specifically are trees in cities associated with human health? And I'm going to talk about this in several ways. First is to present some information from a literature review that is very fresh. We've got it out for review now. Then to talk about some economic implications. That's coming from some current analysis that we're doing. And finally, what does this mean for urban forest planning, planting, and management? All right, I'll start with a scoping review. This is an article, it's now under review, and it was a collaborative effort, University of Washington, in part supported by the Forest Service, but also Health Canada and Natural Resources Canada. So it was an international collaboration. And our team, myself, a couple of graduate students, Sharon Lamb and Jennifer McKean, Gregory Richardson, who is with the Health Canada Ministry, Matilda Vanden Bosch and Adrina, both with the University of British Columbia. Here's what we did. This represents months of work. First, we did a keyword search, and this is a pretty typical procedure for a literature review. And we did a scoping review, which was to try to capture the full range of this research literature at this time, having to do specifically with trees and health. So we did the keyword search across multiple browsers and search engines. Then we did a review of abstracts to focus further those studies that were relevant to trees and health. Then we did a quality assessment. So there was a certain amount of material. They were more concept papers. They might have been sort of editorial comment. Those went away. They're important, but those went aside. And finally, we had an article set of about 200 articles that specifically focused on trees and health. Now remember, the broader array of nature and health is in the thousands. So it took us a bit of time to screen and narrow this focus on trees. And there are probably articles out there that included trees by way of measuring NDVI, of measuring parks, of measuring gardens, and so on. But these were the articles that specifically mentioned the relationship of trees to health. All right, there's a lot going on here. This is a summary figure. It's called a Sankey diagram. This is a summary figure of what we encountered in this collection of 200 articles. First of all, on the left are the different conditions, tree conditions or situations that were studied in the articles. Then we used a prior literature review to filter those in terms of health, reducing harm, building capacities, restoring capacities. And I won't speak about that very much. When our article comes out, you can go back and look at that in more detail if you'd like. But what I want to focus on is the various health outcomes there in that segmented bar or segmented column, ranging from air pollutants to cardiovascular function, and then some other topics that were not represented by very many studies. The width of the blue bands represents the number of articles. And so you see crime, for instance, not much research has been done. Tree pollen and VOCs, quite a bit of work, and I'll speak about that a little bit more later because it's an important thing to recognize when speaking to public health officials. Finally then, on the right side, you see again the pace of publications. So you see the rate of publication across different topics across decades. And again, the surge of tree work, less so, but nature and health, there's a lot of it coming out. We have been scanning English language journals. There's probably material coming out in other languages. Just noting a lot of work coming out of China now, probably as that nation has been working towards greater urban development. They are doing more work concerning nature and health, including trees. All right, what did we learn? First of all, this is the range of types of tree conditions that were studied in these research projects. Single trees, park trees, pollen, simulations where you can get at more experimental approaches using simulations or images. Immersion, not unlike forest bathing, a lot of research. And then those larger scale, full city, regional, even national studies, looking at tree canopy or trees as a component of NDVI. What did we learn? So here again are the studies representing different topics. This is the same as what you saw in that earlier, more complicated diagram, but here we've pulled out the nature elements. I want to make a comment about tree pollen and VOCs. You see there, most of these bars represent positive results, not completely consistent, not the best research methods, but still positive results. Tree pollen, on the other hand, we encountered a number of studies that indicated allergy response or asthma. What we found was in these studies that, so there are techniques that people use by applying materials to skin to check for allergy. And so there's a whole bunch of studies in the medical realm where different pollens were applied to skin, the pinprick, skin prick test, and they indicated allergy to some extent. So two things to take away from that. There were just a few studies that compared pollen allergy to other allergens. And what those studies found is that the pollen allergies were less response than allergies people, particularly children, encountered indoors. So dust mites, mold spores, things like that. So that's something in these discussions with public health people to recognize. The other element of this that we encountered was, so we searched PubMed, which is the go-to health article, health study search engine for doctors and public health officials, PubMed. We found a prevalence of these pollen studies in PubMed, and a lot of the other studies about trees and health are not even in PubMed. They don't make it in because of the sourcing, the journal sourcing, the disciplinary sourcing. So what we see is probably a heightened awareness of tree pollen and respiratory issues in the medical community, and they don't even know about or have access to the other articles that show some of the other benefits of trees. Again, this might be a key message as you're speaking with health officials and doctors about the role of nature and trees and health. And here again, another display of the incredible acceleration of publication. And this is specifically about trees and health. We have a much smaller number of articles, but nonetheless, you see the pace of publication. So now let me move to the economic implications. And this is very fresh work, literally underway. I'm working on some of the writing of this later today. Really basic economics. Econ 101, right, is supply and demand, purchasing, supply sets price. As we all know, this sort of analysis, this curve analysis doesn't work with urban forestry because we can determine costs of urban forestry, but the benefits, estimating the economic elements of the benefits is quite difficult. And so you can't set the supply and demand curve very easily because we don't have tangible or we don't have market values that establish these price points. We don't have easy ways to let communities know, to let them know what the demand is so that you can equate that to what it will take to improve the urban forest in communities. This is really important, though, when we come to healthcare spending. This blows my mind. When I first encountered these numbers, every person per capita, the average annual spending is now over $10,000. Some people spend much more than that, others much less, but still on a per capita basis. And this represents in total about $3.5 trillion annually, every single year. And that's about 18% of our gross domestic product. So the case that I make is having trees does not completely eliminate or certain diseases or heal you outright, but if we have the presence of trees as a social determinant and can shave off 20%, 10%, 5%, even 2% of these sorts of numbers, we're looking at a substantial possible local budget for tree care, tree planting and tree care. All right, again, to kind of set this up as you might engage in conversations with healthcare professionals or public health. All right, these are the leading causes of death in the US. Fairly recent statistics: diabetes, Alzheimer's, and dementia more generally. Heart disease, cardiovascular is up there, has been in the top cause of death for some time. And I'll note that many of these diseases and their relative rank is common among other industrialized nations. Japan, for instance, many of the nations in Western Europe. This list is similar as well as the general ranking. What we see here, think back 100 years, what would be the diseases and illnesses on this chart? It would be those that are caused by viruses. It would be those that are fairly short term. You contract the disease, it may lead to death, or you heal, you get well and continue life. These are all diseases that are with us for a long time, and they're very expensive to treat. Here's another expression of that. What this represents, the bottom figure or the bottom line is age, from when we're born to older age, late decades of age. And these lines then represent various diseases that express themselves as we age. Again, that list is similar to the last slide that I showed you, but what I want to call out here is that, again, these are chronic diseases, very expensive to treat, to maintain health or to maintain functional wellness. And look what happens, they stack. As most people, as we age, as we have these chronic diseases, they're stacked. We rarely have only one. So diabetes is often connected to cardiovascular issues. And then mental health issues, often there are other physiological factors that are interrelated with mental health. So as life goes on, more and more expense to individuals and to society more broadly. All right, so moving now into the project. A little bit of history. Some of you I presented before. Here again is a little bit of refresher. How do we do these analyses? First, we look for the benefits that nature might provide, be it trees, nature, parks, gardens, and looking at that at a human scale, from the individual response to entire communities. We think then about what is that green condition that initiates or promotes that benefit, and then to tackle those valuation strategies. And that's where it gets really messy. That's an economics term, right? Messy. Some prior work that I did with some economists at Mississippi State University, Mark Measles and Steve Grado, also Alicia Robbins, who's an economist now with Weyerhaeuser. We did, this was just the first cut, really connecting, just touching the surface of all of these potential values. And for these illnesses or disorders, we found a potential range of $3 billion to about $7 billion savings per year for the entire US. And again, that was just our first effort, and we're continuing to do this sort of work. There are peer-reviewed articles that summarize that work, but this, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, we summarize the work in this brochure called Nature's Riches, and it's available as a PDF. So if you search Nature Conservancy, Nature's Riches, this should come up pretty quickly. And if you open up the brochure, the PDF, what you see is across the human life cycle, again, from very early age to as we age and become older, what are the potential health benefits of interacting with nature? And then for some of these, many of them actually, we then reported briefly the economic impact, the potential economic impact of people having routine encounters with trees, nature in cities. And so now that process that we did looking at nature more broadly, we are now funneling into this focus on trees. And again, Jim introduced the Tree Fund, and I'm really appreciative of the funding that we've received to do this work from the Tree Fund. All right, as I said, messy. So just about a month ago, we sat down, did some whiteboarding from those 200 articles, all right? So we did the scoping review, that's underway, it's being reviewed, and then now looking within those 200 articles, which ones showed the strongest potential for economic value. And this rough figure, this scratch board that we did, is the beginning of that process. Part of that process is to look for strength of evidence. And let me just say, the research methodology is all over the place in these studies. Correlational studies, where you have large-scale nature expression, tree canopy, and then the evidence might be cardiovascular or stress reduction. And those are promising. Those are promising studies, but they don't show a causal linkage. They show a relationship between the nature and the outcome, but they don't tell us which direction it's going necessarily. Then there's some quasi-experimental studies, and these are situations where there's something happened in a community that has a somewhat of an experimental character. And Jeff Donovan's study of EAB, the loss of trees to emerald ash borer across some counties in the upper Midwest, he found cardiovascular and respiratory health implications of the loss of those trees. So that was quasi-experimental. That's better because now we see a directional influence in the research. The strongest and the benchmark of the medical and public health community is an experiment. Randomized controlled trials. Think of, say, drug trials, for instance, where you have groups of people, they're randomly assigned. Some receive the placebo, some receive the treatment. At the end, you can fairly confidently then say a causal, the treatment was or was not a causal mechanism in the outcome. Admittedly, these RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are really hard to do because we're talking about planting things that may take years, maybe even decades, to become most effective at health improvement. The experimental studies within trees and health tend to be laboratory, using simulations or using short-term behavioral interventions. There we are. So, strength of evidence. Where we found the strongest for valuation potential was the studies about cardiovascular disease, some of those about mental disease, and a subset of the mental disease was the ADHD. Some of those that were pretty good are diabetes, respiratory illness, asthma, and healing and recovery, meaning in hospitals. Think Roger Ulrich in his study about surgery recovery. Pretty good there. Promising, though very little study to date, is cancer. I think we saw 2 studies about cancer, and they were again correlational, but showed a positive outcome of tree views and experiences in cancer recovery. So here's what we have for the valuation potential. And now we're moving these to try to extract some dollar values. These are, if you will, the more clinical illnesses. These are the types of illnesses that a doctor, a physician, a nurse will look at a patient and be able, by way of the traits that they're expressing, to say, you know, you've got heart disease, or this is a mental disorder that you're experiencing. And so these are the ones, because there are economic valuations more broadly out there about the cost implications of these things, these are the ones that we're working most directly with to try to determine value. And these are substantial. Okay, these are not the values provided by trees. These are the overall annual costs of some of these diseases in our nation. And so we, again, are trying to develop a defensible extraction of a portion of these values that can be attributed to trees and urban forestry. And that's underway. And I was hoping to have that done by now. Messy. It's taking us a bit longer than I expected. But nonetheless, you can see here the economic consequences of these diseases and the potential for the presence of trees in people's lives and in the area, in the spaces where they may be undergoing treatment, to have economic impact. All right, now there's another set of studies that in the terms of public health, trees provide a protective situation, all right? Trees help reduce stress. That's some of the strongest evidence we have, particularly from the forest bathing literature in Japan. Certain mental functions, attention restoration, and so on, strong evidence. Social cohesion as well. Pretty good evidence about birth weight, healthier birth weight with having trees, pain relief, crime reduction, thermal comfort, and so on. And then others not so certain: physical activity, weight control, screening of UV, better sleep, a little bit of work coming along about better sleep, which is so important to our mental and physical health. The difficulty with these is these are all protective. In other words, they encourage or they promote better health, but the consequences, we are not able to find direct economic valuation because stress reduction is a pathway. Many of these are a pathway that lead to all sorts and interrelated health outcomes. So these alone or directly are difficult to value, but they're there. And I think they're important to talk about whenever we speak again to the medical or public health community about the importance of trees. There's just a little bit of work out there already about trees, urban forestry, and economic valuation. Here's an article, Min Kuo, a familiar name. Matthew Browning, you should be checking Matthew Browning's work. He's does some really great work, and some of it does include analysis of urban forest canopy. All right, that was a very quick overview of some of the latest work that I've been involved in. And what I think we have enough to say, though, that this all has implications for urban forest planning and planting and management. And, you know, we have the bumper stickers, we have the slides, trees are good, but I'll suggest to you, they could be better. They could be better if we more strategically plan and plant specifically for human health. And I just see that as something that will come along in the near future. I'm starting to publish a little bit about that. How do we translate this all to policy? And with economics being perhaps one motivation for that. Some of the latest work about dosage, trees, nature, and dosage. Canopy, very interesting. Stress reduction, canopy goals. 35 to 40% looks to be about optimal for stress reduction. Connectivity, planting trees in a way that offers the people an opportunity for a 20 to 50 minute walk. 20 to 50 minute walks appears to be a very valuable dosage for encounters of trees outdoors. Pollen, doctors, again, their awareness of these pollen studies, so tree selection for species and for gender, I guess you'd call it, that reduces incidence of pollen allergy. And then enable activity. Plant to promote activities that we now know from research seem to encourage or motivate people to be active outdoors, which is an important pathway to prevention of many different chronic diseases. So, can you enable forest bathing? Can you create walking loops? One study done by the RAND Corporation has found that walking loops are really important in safe, secure places for people to be outdoors and active. So thinking about scale, if you work at the site scale, maybe your work is about individual trees, more at the arboriculture scale. Some of you are urban foresters, you're working at community or landscape scale. Some of you are doing analysis and projects that scale an entire city. Within all of that, this research suggests the importance of either drilling down or elevating out when thinking about trees and health. Here's an article 2 weeks ago, published this. This is a collaboration I did with some people at the University of British Columbia, and we gathered studies about trees for health and trees for climate resilience. And we translated that research to some design recommendations. So I'll share these with you really quickly. The article's out there. There's no cost. It's an open access article, so you might want to take a look. First is view from within. Optimize the opportunity for people if they're indoors, workplace, school, to look out and see trees. And plant entrances. So as people are coming and going from a facility, offer them the opportunity to encounter that green envelope and the health benefit that that might provide, including stress reduction. Bring nature nearby. So many of the studies indicate that frequent routine encounters with nature is what's important. So embellish around buildings within places where people spend a lot of time, and retain the mature large trees. For the climate aspect of this, we found, of course, not unlike the results we gained from iTree, large trees, but also from a psychological perspective, large trees are very valuable. Generate diversity. So optimize existing biodiversity in terms of the genera or species diversity. This is becoming increasingly of interest to the public health community because the discovery is encounters outdoors, contact with soils, with vegetation, with wild things is part of the build out of our microbiome, our gut health. And gut health, improved gut health, improves our mental functioning. I found this linkage really remarkable, improves immune function and so on. So biodiversity in your plantings and thinking about how people can connect or contact, particularly children, that diversity is really important. Create refuge. Those of you who are in cities where you're seeing greater peak summer heat events, I'm reading and hearing about islands of trees, places that are refuge, where people can go during those hot events because maybe they don't have AC, or frankly, maybe they don't want to stay indoors during the entire duration of that peak heat event. I'm even hearing about cities where people move out of the buildings, temporary time, into parks, and they sort of camp in the parks. They're not homeless, but the parks offer that refuge during the heat events. Connect experiences. So think about your tree plantings as a series of experiences, diverse experiences, fun experiences, whimsical experiences, perhaps including art, as people encounter and move through the city. And then finally, an obvious one again from iTree and other ecosystem services analyses, optimize that green infrastructure, which is a combination of design for function, design for benefit, thinking about the different layers, the structure of that urban forest, and making the most of that investment. There you are. And I must admit, I haven't been monitoring time very well. I hope we have indeed some time for questions, comments. But again, I mentioned these slides will be available to you if you'd like to access them. If you go to Nature Within, the link there on the top right, what's new, you'll be able to get the slides. I'm at this conference now. Give me a couple of days, but I will have them up if you'd like to look back at those again. And some time maybe for questions, comments, or suggestions. If any of you have colleagues that work in economics that might have an interest in this, please let me know. For years, I've been talking to economists in public health, and they're like, oh, nature, no, that's not what we do. And then I've spoken to economists in natural resources and forestry, and they're like, health? No, that's not what we do. So that collaboration with Steve Grado and Mark Measles was really valuable, but I'm open to other collaborations on people who might be able to continue this work. So we'll leave it there and see if we have any questions or comments.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we're both on speaking. This is Jim Urban again. So I've been jotting down the questions that have been coming in, and if you do have questions, please type them into the question and answer field, and I'm keeping an eye on those and organizing them as they're coming in. The one question was very germane to your last comment, Kathleen, and that there's a lot of discussion that lifestyle and diet are really critical to many of these health outcomes. And what if you were trying to compare the importance of lifestyle and diet versus the impact of trees on these diseases? Are they in the same ballpark? Where do they rank?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure that I've seen any sort of formal assessment of the relative importance of different social determinants of health. We know not only diet and lifestyle, but housing, adequate housing, economic development, personal economic development, access to employment, and so on. So I really don't know what the relative strength is, but I will say, particularly lifestyle. So what do we know about lifestyle that is compromising health? One is more screen time. We're far more sedentary in our everyday lives than people have ever been before. And the consequence of spending more time in the chair, combined with looking at screens, is leading to a variety of health issues. BMI, body mass index, mental health concerns, as well as very specific physiological responses. Increased stress. So in terms of lifestyle, I would say that trees are very important. And that's one of the strongest outcomes of both the nature and health literature, as well as the tree and health literature, is being outdoors, intermittent, routine outdoor activity is very important as a mediator or as an antidote to a variety of health situations. And so lifestyle is a very broad term. And I have to say myself, having read literally thousands of these articles, I have really changed my lifestyle. I now will get up away from my desk. I try to do this every 2 hours and go for a walk, be it in a building, but I try to get outdoors, 15, 20 minutes, walking break. The Mayo Clinic now compares sitting, long periods of sitting, equivalent to smoking in terms of cardiovascular effects. Other lifestyle opportunities is the immersion. So the forest bathing idea can be a lifestyle element in that you try to find places, hopefully near your home, workplace, school, where you spend a lot of time, and immerse yourself. It could even be a streetscape that is heavily planted. Immerse yourself in that green and become mindful. So not just immerse yourself and watch your phone while doing so, but becoming mindful of the surroundings and the elements of that natural environment. These are things that I've incorporated into my life, and I'm hearing more and more people doing that. The idea of forest bathing, I was recently at a conference dedicated to forest bathing, and there was a speaker from Japan, a young woman, entrepreneurial. She has started a business, and she is consulting only to corporations, the private sector, and she has set up forest bathing opportunities within their campus facilities or near their facilities, as well as more remote locations for longer duration experiences beyond the city. That to me is a direct lifestyle intervention that maybe we can take to heart and start to incorporate more broadly within our communities.
Yeah, there was one question about what is forest bathing. I think you've gone into that a bit. But just as a point, when my wife and I go somewhere, we'll often say, should we take the forest bathing route or the quick route? And often the answer will be, let's drive down the forest bathing road. And I'm not sure that counts in terms of forest bathing, but we actually seek out those opportunities to immerse ourselves in there.
Why does that not surprise me, Jim?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, may I comment on that? Yeah, so the forest bathing and a more preferred label for it actually now is forest therapy. And studies have been done for over a decade, some pretty conclusive research. And in response to that, the country, the nation of Japan now has 22 dedicated forest bathing bases around the country. And these are places that people can go, again, for a little longer duration. It might be a weekend or a little longer. But there are also forest bathing drives, roads. And I did a bike ride in Japan 3 years ago, had no idea about these, but stumbled into, it was a guided tour, and we just stumbled into this forest bathing road. Full canopy, wonderful, very low speed, recommended speed, very curvy, so you really couldn't travel very fast. So that's, that might be another option that we incorporate into our cities.
We had a couple of questions that are really related to scale of the trees and the plants, and how important are really large mature trees, meaning you had mentioned years or maybe a decade, but we're talking many decades to produce a really large tree versus smaller size trees. And also, what is the importance of the other layers of the landscape, tree, the shrubs, the understory canopy, understory trees, shrubs of different varieties, and turf versus gardens, for example.
So I'm going to go back to this article, greening blocks, and a couple of the people on the author team there, Angie Wu, is a sustainability director for a hospital system, healthcare system in Vancouver, British Columbia. And Aaron Desautel is also in the public health community. So the guidelines that we generated for this article were highly interpretive, and frankly, they're research questions. They are research hypotheses, but we thought it was important to start to introduce these considerations of design and planning with a health and climate orientation. So now to get to your question, Jim, the specifics of trees versus turf and as well as size of trees is really getting at the dosage question. And questions of dosage, how much, how often, is it different for people of different age, different times in their lives? Those are the things that are being teased out now, and there really aren't strong conclusions. I will say that a combination of preference and health response suggests that large trees do have greater value than smaller trees. Structure within that, so say you have some level of understory or you don't, is an important dosage question that I don't think has been resolved. I often get questions about so many of the studies and then the slides that I presented are temperate forest areas. And I've had a number of people, as I do talks around the US and other nations, is, well, what about deserts? Or what about wetlands? And there's just a smidge of research now coming out assessing other types of ecosystems and human health response. So in terms of trees versus turf, many people are probably aware of some of the research that has been done by the Kaplans, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan at the University of Michigan. And their work has suggested that a ground plane that offers the opportunity to understand the landscape, to look out and kind of get a sense of what's around you, combined with tree overstory is a highly valued landscape, and that that probably relates to some of the work that Ming Kuo and Bill Sullivan have done, probably relates to a sense of security and thus crime response in those spaces as well. Tree canopy, another dimension of this. Bill Sullivan has done some really interesting work with his colleagues where they have experimentally revealed to people using simulations different degrees of canopy cover up to about 0 to 60%, and find that stress reduction proceeds progressively up to about 35, 40%. And then it kind of levels off. It continues a bit, but it kind of levels off. So there you are, a variety of circumstances, health response to vegetation, but the community of science doing this work is still kind of moving into those details, if you will. I'll also mention sound. Really interesting work starting to come along about sound, the importance of sound and health response within urban environments and the influence of vegetation.
So the flip side of a lot of, as we add more plants to the urban landscape, we quickly bump into the other pieces of what controls how we design the urban environment. So security and safety advocates will argue for greater views, less shrubs, less, essentially giving you a total view of your field of play, imaged by the photo that you've got on your question and answer, to be able to see threats, etc. And another question on, does the species matter? Will we have cancer trees around cancer facilities, for example, that have been shown to be better at reducing whatever influences they may have on cancer patients? Are we that far along yet?
All right, there are really a couple of questions there, and I'll start with the last one because it's a short answer. We are not there yet in terms of species, in terms of plant specification, with regard to health. And I make these statements. This is as far as I know. Perhaps there may be some research out there that I'm just not aware of. But that degree of specification, linking to specific health outcomes, we're largely not there yet. And the interest in dosage study, there's a lab in Barcelona, Spain, that is doing some tremendous work, and they're moving into dosage studies of nature and health, not trees in particular, but we might be seeing something coming there. But then to go to this idea, not unlike this image of being able to see the clear view, and often an insistence by some people in law enforcement that, you know, this is the way we have to manage vegetation. So this really aligns with CPTED principles, crime prevention through environmental design. And the first generation of CPTED was this sort of physical response: clear out the ground plane, limb up the trees. But version 2 or generation 2 of CPTED said, well, it's not only physical structure, it's the social dimensions within that spaces. And me being a social scientist, I really relate to that perspective. So there are ways, not unlike these chairs, of, you know, what are ways to bring more people into that green space, and by way of sort of self-awareness, self-policing, reducing the need to strip away all vegetation, that first generation CPTED response. To that point, an organization in Seattle is working on CPTED principles for natural areas around Seattle and King County. And they asked me to review the report, and I said, you know, you really missed on the social dimension side. So they asked me, I should learn to keep my mouth shut. They asked me to write in that portion, the social side. So as I share these slides, perhaps I'll put in a link somewhere to this CPTED report, and people might find that of interest to look at what are the pruning practices that, short of removing all of the ground plane vegetation, might encourage more visibility, first generation CPTED, but then this component of how to welcome people, how to let them know that they are welcome to move through a space, and the more people they are, perhaps the more secure, more perception of security and thus crime reduction within that space.
Some of the questions that we have here are really looking for greater degrees of data and concrete answers from this webinar, which, having spoken at a number of these short webinars, it's really impossible to get the level of data. But one thing I found about Kathleen's site is that that's where the data is. And if you have a particular question and you really want hard data, you'll find it there fairly easily. So I would encourage people who are thinking about whatever to explore the website. I see a question here is, you know, any research on hearing birds singing to provide health benefits. I'm going to bet that there's something there that you may have in this fabulous resource you're offering.
And I'll add to that, Jim. So recall that the broader nature and health literature is thousands of articles, and I probably pick up another dozen or more every week. It is happening so fast. But then the trees and health, we're looking at 200 articles, and we worked hard to screen, to first locate and then to screen to those that provide defensible evidence, because the purpose of this work for me is not to convince tree people, arborists, urban foresters. We all know this intuitively. The purpose of this work for me is to provide information that can be shared with public health officials, with school superintendents, with doctors, with those who may not be that aware. They may not have any sense at all of the importance of that environment outside the walls of their clinic or hospital or facility. 200 articles, and not a lot of them are very conclusive in the evidence because of research method. And I don't fault the investigators, because I've been in that situation myself. You do the best research you can with the resources you have. And frankly, up until recently, there just wasn't a lot of funding for this realm. So I would like to share more detail, and the articles we're working on will, of course, elaborate more. But there's not yet a lot of direct evidence of trees specifically in health. Nature more broadly in cities, yes, it's coming along at a very fast pace. But that's sort of the caveat in all of this.
Yeah. So I'm going to invite Megan to come back in.
Yep. Thank you, Jim. Just wanted to interject. I launched a poll, and if you guys want to move that to the side, feel free to do so. But I wanted to make sure we captured just a quick poll I launch at the end of every webinar. So yeah, did you want to leave it there, or did you want to take a couple more questions? It's totally up to you guys.
Well, I'm good to keep going. We've got about 450 people left on the call. That's a lot of people. So Kathleen, it's really your show.
Yeah, I've got a few extra minutes here, please.
Okay. So I'm looking down my, what are the research gaps that if you were to, and if there were some researchers on the call or people who are working in that area, what are the research gaps you would point them to?
All right. How much time do we have? All right. Let's see. So there have been a number of research literature reviews related to nature and health. And some colleagues of mine at the University of Washington and I did a research agenda article. It's in Environmental Health Perspectives. It's about 2 years out now. And in that article, there are key needs for research and knowledge building. And so many of the questions that we called out, the article starts with sort of this trending of what do we know, and then quickly moves to where should we put more resources to consolidate this research, if you will. So that article is very relevant to this question here as well. What I will add to that is what really speaks to the medical community is replication. So, any of the recommendations that we read about for diet or lifestyle or treatments that comes from the medical community, they're rarely one-off studies. They're usually replicates. People have done them, studies multiple times, different locations, slight nuances in the research method, different age groups, and so on. We don't do that replication in this research. And so it becomes difficult to say conclusively, this leads to this. So what I would encourage, and maybe this is a tree fund effort, ISA, I don't know, but to start to reckon with, are there some standardized research methods, not to limit people's creativity, but to start to generate these replicates that can make a stronger case for the presence of trees and health. And so I'll just leave it at that. There's much more that can be said. And I will say that the trees and health research it's what's the word? Nascent. There's so much opportunity, but with that opportunity, people tend to go off in many directions and method. And if we can somehow package it a little more cleanly in how we do this and how we communicate it, I think that would serve us well.
Well, in the end, it all boils down to money.
Yeah.
And that's why we started the Tree and Soil Research Fund to specifically look at those kinds of questions. But I can assure the audience that, because I'm on the research committee, when we're reviewing grants, and each year we we probably start out with 15 grants, of which 5 or 8 of them are all worthy of receiving a grant. And then we have enough money for 1 or 2. And we use our knowledge of where we think the research gaps are, the replication issues in our decision-making process of narrowing that group of 5 down to 1, because we're trying to put our money where it may be best used. But to all the people left in the call, if you can make a contribution to the tree fund and designate it for the tree and soil research fund, that's probably the single best thing that you can do right now. And join me at the tree fund. We're always looking for people to serve on committees and that kind of thing, and you can really have a big impact on that. So we're almost quarter past the hour. Kathleen, are you able to look over the questions that we missed and maybe provide some feedback offline to the listeners?
Let's see. The tech platform here, I haven't been looking at the questions.
So Kathleen, all the webinar or all the questions are archived. So I'll make sure that you have them. And if there's a question that comes up a bunch, we can easily send that out to all of the people that were registered. So why don't we leave it there? And thank you so much, Kathy, for a wonderful webinar and taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Monica. And everybody should stay tuned for an email from me that registered, and we will have some important information coming towards you. And if you're asking if this webinar was archived and recorded, yes, all of our webinars are recorded and will be available within 24 hours. So you can all share and watch them as many times as you want. And Kathy said, I believe you said you'll have the slides available on your website. So that will be something people will be asking about, and I will be happy to point them to your website.
Okay. Or Megan, I'll share the link with you, and maybe you could distribute it by way of those emails again.
That's a wonderful idea, and then we can go right to the source, and you don't have to worry about updating your website or anything. So,
okay. Thank
you so much, everybody. Everybody have a wonderful day, and signing off from Nevada.